specifically, we're going to cover the subject of Noah and the ark. Now, this is a timely story for us to review, not just because of the similarities from Noah's day to our own. We've just started a new calendar year, which many use as sort of a reset button. And the story of the flood is very literally that. God was resetting how things were happening on the earth. There's more that we can draw from Noah's life. There are numerous ways to view it and apply the instruction. But for our purposes, we're going to take a very specific view of the flood, or the story of the flood. And that view is this: Noah's life is a lesson in godly obedience. Noah's life is a lesson in godly obedience. Now, Noah first shows up in Genesis 5, which contains a genealogy from Adam onwards through to Noah. And Noah is introduced as a son of Lamech. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse 29, Lamech gives reason for Noah's name and bemoans the state that the world is in. And then in the start of Genesis 6, God echoes Lamech's lament and decides it's time to do something about it. And of all the people in that world, only Noah found grace in God's eyes. We see that in Genesis 6:8. Though he was living in the midst of a wicked world, Noah obediently followed God's instruction. We see this in several places in the account. It's even hiding in plain sight in Genesis 6 and verse 9, where Noah is described as walking with God. Now, this is a very special distinction that only one other person is given. Now, suffice it to say, God's not going to be walking with someone who is ignoring his ways. So let's pick up the story in Genesis chapter 6. If you want to open your Bibles, we're going to start in Genesis 6 and in verse 14. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Now, right here, God is providing crucial instruction. The ark is being built in a 1:6 ratio, the ratio of the width to the length of the boat, and that gave it extraordinary stability. In fact, ocean-going boats are often built today with that same ratio. This was important because the ark wasn't going to have any steering, it didn't have any sails, it needed to be stable for what was about to come. Continuing on in verse 16, you shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. And he tells them to bring birds, creeping things, 2 of every kind. And he also tells Noah, bring food on board as well, just for themselves as well as for the animals. In verse 22, we see more proof of Noah's obedience. Thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him. So he did. He didn't do some of it. He didn't do most of it. He didn't do his best. He did all that God commanded. We see this repeated in chapter 7. In verse 1, God tells Noah to go into the ark with his family, and then the animals. We also see then in verse 2 of chapter 7, the instruction around the animals being brought on was expanded. There were still only 2 of the unclean animals being brought on, but 7 or 7 pairs, depending on the translation, of the clean animals were to be saved. Again, verse 5 reiterates, Noah did as he was commanded. And while the flood occurs, Noah continues to be obedient to God. And this wasn't just a short trip. I mean, have you actually stopped to think about how long Noah was on the ark? Now, for all the times that I've read through the account or heard it spoken about from the lectern, it's always stuck in my head as just being 40 days and 40 nights, right? Because that's the part of the story that sticks out. But that's not the case. That's just how long the rains were on the earth. So let's do some quick math. In Genesis 7:11, we're given a reference point, a starting point. It's the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month and the 17th day. Verse 12 tells us the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. But if we look at verse 24, we see very clearly the flood was more than just those 40 days. Genesis 7 and verse 24. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. But still, the flood's not done. Genesis 8 and verse 4 tells us that it wasn't until the 7th month and the 17th day that the ark finally rested on the mountain. So at that point, Noah and his family, they've been on the boat already for 5 months. But it wasn't until the 10th month that the tops of the other mountains could be seen. It's not 40 days after that Noah first sends out the raven and the dove. It took 2 more weekly cycles after that for that dove to not come back. And through this all, Noah remained obedient to God. So let's pick the account back up in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So recall, the flood started in the 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day. So now we're in the 601st year, 1st day, 1st month. Still, Noah waited. We go into verse 14. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So we've skipped forward another month and 26 days. That brings us to 1 year and 10 days since those rains first started on the earth. Noah was still on the ark, waiting for instruction from God. And then in verse 15, we see that instruction. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, went out of the ark. So we have to realize that Noah remained on the ark even after he saw that the land was dry. The ark had settled on the mountain, and the waters were consistently going down. And eventually even the dove did not come back. Noah removed the roof of the boat and saw a changed world around him. Even though his eyes showed him that the land was dry, he waited for God's instruction. He waited till God told him it was time to finally leave that safe ark. Then and only then did he and his family and all the animals disembark. Then in verse 20, we have another record of Noah's obedience. Genesis 8 and verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So there's several different things that we have hiding in this verse. First, we see that Noah maintained that distinction between clean and unclean animals. We can infer that he didn't have them commingled on the ark, as he was able to easily pull out the ones that he wanted for the sacrifice. Of course, it also shows us that Noah did know about clean and unclean well before Mount Sinai, because God never had to explain which ones were clean and unclean or which ones were okay to use for the sacrifice. We also see Noah's obedience, that he did offer these burnt offerings. Noah knew that he needed to give an offering to God as thanks for the salvation that God had given to Noah and his family. So Noah built an altar to God and did precisely that. We continue on into chapter 9. We see Noah's obedience continue forth. He was told to be fruitful and multiply and bring forth abundantly in the earth. And so he did. We see the results of that today. I mean, what Noah did so long ago is plainly evident for us today. That's why his story still resonates for us. Godly obedience, it's a bright thread running throughout the story of Noah. His story is a warning to society, but it's also an encouraging example for us today. Though Noah walked with God, he was still just a man. He lived in a troubled society and no doubt had problems of his own. And we see towards the end of his story, there's some other familial problems that creep in there, right? So he was not a perfect, but he still is described as walking with God. And like Noah, we're living in a crumbling world. And we may not be being set out to build a massive ark, but we can look at God's promises as being our own lifeboat in these troubled times. And that's what we need to remember from Noah's story. No matter where the waves toss us around, we need to walk steadfastly with God. No matter how long those waves are tossing us around, we need to walk with God. God's going to carry us through the stormy weather. Then, when the waters settle, our feet will be planted back on solid ground, onto the solid ground of God's faithful promises.